Hello. This week, Parsha Shmini contains two major topics. The first is the inauguration ceremony for the Mishkan, a theme which is picked up from much earlier in the narrative in Shemos. And once that is finished, including the tragic death of the two elder sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, it moves to kashrus, foods that are permitted, animals, birds, fish, insects that are permitted and those that are forbidden, and associated rules of ritual purity. Just two themes. Now, when it comes to explaining the purpose of the dietary laws, there are, in essence, two approaches. The first is a rationalist approach, favoured by the Rambam and those who follow that approach, which is that the kosher foods are healthy, the non-kosher foods are unhealthy. And then there's a metaphysical stroke mystical approach that they're bad for you in some spiritual sense. So choices are between reasons of physical health and reasons of spiritual health. And both have strengths and weaknesses. The first is the rationalist, but there are plenty of people, Jews and non-Jews, who eat non-kosher foods of all varieties and are perfectly healthy. And there are plenty of Jews who adhere to a completely kosher diet and are unhealthy. And so it does not seem to be a great correlation, although of course there can always be other factors. The second approach, the more metaphysical, spiritual approach, is consonant with many of the themes of Vayikra about purity and spiritual development, but much harder to relate to. So, if we look at the end section of the Kashrut laws, this is the final sequence of chapter 11 of Yud Aleph. Ki ani Hashem, having detailed all the laws, for I am the Lord, Hamaleschem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brings you up from the land of Egypt, lios lochem le'elohim, to be a God for you. V'yisem kadoshim, you should be holy, ki kodosh oni, because I am holy. Zos Torah sabahemov ha'oif. This is the law of the animal and of the bird, v'choil nefesh hachaya, on all living creatures, haremeses b'mayim, which swarm in water, u'lechoil nefesh hasheretis ala oretz, and every living thing that creeps upon the earth, meaning that's a summary of all these laws given by the God who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And what's that for? Lahavdil, to distinguish bein hatomei uvein hatohor, between the impure and the pure, uvein hachayo hanecheles, uvein hachayo asher lo se ochel, and between living creatures that may be eaten and living creatures that you should not eat. Now, Rav Hirsch is very opposed to the rationalist Maimonidean understanding, and it's kind of easy to see why. Rav Hirsch is writing in the mid-19th century, where there's a great development of science, and scientific explanation is scientific understanding is casting aspersions on these sorts of explanations. And Rav Hirsch says that this sequence that we've just read makes it very clear. Let us now summarize what the Torah says about the foods that it forbids. They are tameos, impure, and are termed shekets. They are termed impure. Eating these foods leads to various sorts of spiritual malaises. The point of the whole section occupies the whole moral pinnacle that is the purpose of the redemption from Egypt. This is why I brought you from Egypt. Not so that you should avoid certain foods that are unhealthy. That's simply a book about nutrition, so that you should have a spiritual dimension to your lives and a relationship with God thereby. Rav Hirsch concludes, in light of all this, it is clear beyond any doubt that the reason for these laws is not bodily health, but the moral integrity of our souls. All the things that are said about the dietary regulations of Mosaic law, in order to justify the assertion that these laws had importance only at a certain time and in certain places, are refuted by the words of the Torah itself. So Rav Hirsch, of course, is fighting back against Enlightenment and early Reform attempts to change or replace or even abolish these rules. These laws are not intended to preserve the health of our bodies, but to ensure the spiritual and moral health of our souls. They guard the central aspects of our personality from unrestrained animalistic passion and keep our moral and spiritual will from becoming dulled and unresponsive. They impress upon us the basic prerequisite for our ability to fulfill our mission. We must keep our physical bodies on the narrow path of living purity. That is what will enable the body to be the obedient servant of the nobler part of our being. So Rav Hirsch, with typical flair, perhaps even better in the original High German, explains very much that he adopts a non-Maimonidean approach. I'm attracted by this approach, and it enables us to answer one remaining question for this Dvar Torah, and that is, how do we explain the relationship between the two sections in the Parsha? Remember, the first is about the inauguration ceremony of the Mishkan and the death of Nadav and Avihu, and the next, apparently unrelated, are the Kashrut laws that we've been discussing. To answer that, we need a Sforno writing much earlier than Rav Hirsch, writing in Renaissance Italy. The Sforno is very much enamoured of the ideal relationship with God and the negative transformational impact that the golden calf has. At a certain stage in history, they are able to relate to God without any particular instruments, without any additional media. They can just relate to God. Then they indicate that they are no longer able to do this. They make the golden calf. And as he puts it, they end up degrading themselves. Their spiritual persona changed. They, as it were in the text, rest down their crowns with which they've been crowned at Sinai, which is an allegory for leaving behind a spiritual aspect of their personality. They damage their relationship with God by making the calf. And then there is a remedy. According to the Sforno, following Rashi, there was never going to be a Mishkan, a specific place for worship, just a simple altar. But once they'd made the golden calf, there was a need to ramp up the space in order to enable people to relate to God. The remedy was the Mishkan, but they also then, having built the Mishkan, having inaugurated it, it was necessary to prepare themselves spiritually to receive the message inside themselves too. And therefore it was necessary to remove any impediments to spiritual receptivity, to allow them to be in a place to properly appreciate the Mishkan. Hence the connection between the two sections, and I think a strong validation of Rav Hirsch's approach that the Kashrut laws are about our spiritual rather than physical development. Shabbos, sei gesund und stark.